Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. The complete timeline of Fallout's America, before the bombs fell. Welcome, wanderer, to the world that was the America that almost made it, that built its dream in chrome and nuclear fire and carried it forward with the particular confidence of a civilization that had never learned to doubt itself completely. Tonight we trace the full arc of that world, from the quiet fork in history where its road diverged from ours, through the decades of abundance and conflict and slow accumulation of consequence, all the way to the morning when the sky answered every question the old world had been avoiding. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the past to carry you gently into the dark. The bombs have not yet fallen, there is still time. Every history begins with a moment so ordinary that no one present understands they are standing inside it. The divergence that produced Fallout's America from the America we know did not announce itself. There was no declaration, no visible rupture in the fabric of events, no morning on which the newspapers carried headlines describing the point at which one possible future closed and another opened in its place. The change was quieter than that and deeper than that. The kind of change that operates at the level of technical decisions and institutional priorities, and the specific directions in which research funding flows in the years immediately following a great war, when a civilization is still deciding what kind of thing it intends to become, and the deciding happens in laboratories and boardrooms and government offices, rather than in the streets where history is usually said to be made. In our world, the decades following the Second World War produced a particular miracle of miniaturization. The transistor, developed in the late 1940s, enabled the progressive compression of computational capability into smaller and smaller physical forms, a process that accelerated across the following decades in ways that transformed not just technology, but the entire architecture of how human beings related to information, to each other, and to the structures of power and knowledge that governed their lives. The personal computer, the internet, the mobile device, the networked world in which the 20th century's physical distances were replaced by the 21st century's instant connection, all of this grew from that initial compression, from the specific decision that the future would be built around the manipulation of information rather than around the manipulation of matter at the atomic level. In Fallout's America, this miniaturization either did not occur or occurred too late and in insufficient form to redirect the technological trajectory that the war years had already established. The transistor's potential was recognized but not developed with the particular urgency and institutional commitment that in our world produced the digital revolution. What filled the space that digital technology would have occupied was something that the war years had already produced in abundance, and that the post-war establishment, military, industrial, governmental, had every reason to continue developing and refining and finding new applications for. Nuclear technology did not merely survive the transition from wartime emergency to peacetime normalcy. It flourished, expanded its domain, and became the organizing metaphor and material foundation of a civilization that had decided its future would be atomic, in a sense, far more comprehensive than anyone in the immediate post-war period had originally intended. This is not simply a story about different gadgets or different energy sources. The divergence between Fallout's technological trajectory and our own produced differences that extended into every corner of the civilization, shaping not just what people used, but how they thought about progress and power, and the relationship between human ambition and natural limit. A civilization built around digital technology develops certain habits of thought, an orientation toward the virtual, toward the network, toward the distributed and the decentralized, toward the idea that information itself is the most valuable resource, and that the manipulation of information is the most powerful form of agency available to individuals and institutions. A civilization built around nuclear technology develops different habits, entirely an orientation toward the physical, toward the concentrated and the hierarchical, toward the idea that energy is the foundational resource, and that the control of energy is the control of everything that energy makes possible. The America that emerged from this different developmental path retained the surface features of the America we recognize from the mid-20th century, with a completeness and a sincerity that our own world's experience makes difficult to fully appreciate. We look at mid-century American culture, the suburban houses, the chrome-finned automobiles, the domestic optimism, the particular confidence of a people who had won a great war and were now building the prosperity that victory was supposed to deliver, and we experience it as historical, as belonging to a specific moment that has passed and been replaced by subsequent moments. In Fallout's America, that moment did not pass in the same way. The aesthetic continued to evolve, continued to develop its own internal logic, continued to produce new expressions of the same underlying values across the following decades, so that by the time the bombs fell in 2077, the visual and cultural language of the civilization still spoke in cadences that our own 1950s would have found recognizable, updated and elaborated, but not fundamentally transformed by the intervening century. This is one of the most important things to understand about the pre-war world, and one of the most difficult to hold clearly in mind when approaching it from outside. The retro-futurist aesthetic that the wasteland preserves in its ruins, the Pip-Boy's rounded screen and analog dials, the Mr. Handy robot's cheerful vocal synthesis, the Nuka-Cola bottle's particular curves, the Vault's institutional optimism rendered in green and yellow. These are not the artifacts of nostalgia. They are not the products of a culture looking backward to a golden age it had lost. They are the genuine expressions of a culture that had never stopped believing in its own version of the future, that had arrived at the 21st century, still in direct conversation with the mid-20th century's particular way of imagining what tomorrow would look like. Because the technological revolution that, in our world, broke that conversation and replaced it with something entirely different had not, in this world, occurred. Understanding this helps explain what is otherwise among the most puzzling aspects of the pre-war world for anyone approaching it from our own historical position, the coexistence of genuine technological sophistication with what appears to be technological stasis. Fallout's pre-war America possessed capabilities that our own world has not yet matched in certain domains. Functional powered exoskeletons, genuinely autonomous robots capable of sustained independent operation, nuclear power plants small enough to fit inside an automobile, energy weapons capable of disintegrating matter at the molecular level. By any reasonable measure, this was a technologically advanced civilization, and yet the computers it used to manage all of this technology were room-sized mainframes with reel-to-reel tape storage. The personal communication devices it carried were bulky objects with cathode ray screens, and its popular culture retained the visual grammar of a century that our own world would classify as historical. The explanation is that this civilization's technological development was not slower than ours, but differently directed, that it had followed nuclear technology with the same intensity and commitment that our world followed digital technology, and that nuclear technology had delivered genuine wonders in the domains it was suited to deliver them, while leaving largely undeveloped the domains where digital technology would have concentrated its own transformative energies. The result was a world of extraordinary nuclear capability and comparatively primitive information technology, of robots that could cook and clean and carry weapons with genuine autonomy, and computers that processed information through systems that our own world had largely moved beyond by the 1980s. Both things were true simultaneously, and together they constituted not a failed version of the future, but a different version of it, one that had its own internal coherence, its own genuine achievements, and its own specific vulnerabilities that would ultimately prove fatal. The emotional register that this divergence establishes for everything that follows is one of the most important things to carry through the pre-war timeline. It would be easy to approach the world before the bombs as a cautionary tale, as the history of a civilization that made the wrong choices and paid the appropriate price, as a story whose function is moral instruction delivered through the mechanism of catastrophe. The Wasteland certainly invites this reading. The ruins are everywhere, the evidence of what was lost is impossible to ignore, and the human cost of what happened on October 23rd, 2077, is written into every aspect of the world the bombs left behind. But the pre-war world, encountered on its own terms and in its own time, was not primarily a catastrophe in the making. It was a civilization complex, contradictory, genuinely capable of beauty and innovation, and the specific forms of human flourishing that civilizations at their best make possible, while simultaneously capable of the cruelty and the blindness and the accumulation of unaddressed consequence that civilizations at their worst make inevitable. The people who lived in it were not figures in a cautionary tale. They were people with the full range of qualities that people possess, the ones who understood what was happening and could not stop it, the ones who did not understand and could not have been expected to, the ones who understood and chose not to look, the ones who built and the ones who maintained, and the ones who consumed what the builders and the maintainers had made possible without thinking much about where it came from or what it cost. The melancholy that the pre-war timeline produces, when approached with sufficient attention, is not the melancholy of a lesson about hubris or the wages of militarism or the dangers of unchecked corporate power, though it contains all of those things. It is the more fundamental melancholy of any world that has ended the specific sadness of knowing that the Tuesday afternoon in the diner, with the Nuka-Cola machine humming in the corner and the television playing above the counter and the ordinary conversation of ordinary people filling the ordinary air, was one of the last such afternoons that world would ever have. The people in the diner did not know that. The melancholy belongs to us, looking back, knowing what they could not know, carrying in our awareness the weight of the ending that the pre-war world was approaching, with the complete innocence of a place that has not yet been told what is coming. This is the road we will travel through the hours ahead, not a condemnation of the world before the bombs, and not a rehabilitation of it either, but an attempt at something more difficult and more honest, an account of what it actually was, in the full complexity of that phrase, across the decades of its particular existence, and through the accumulating pressures that the resource wars and the Sino-American conflict and the slow depletion of the natural foundations of its prosperity applied to a civilization whose foundational assumptions had never fully equipped it to manage the kinds of stresses that history was preparing to deliver. The bombs have not yet fallen. The diner is still open. The Nuka-Cola machine is still humming. Let us begin at the beginning and follow this world forward through all its years and all its choices until we arrive at the morning that arrived at it. The promise that nuclear technology made to Fallout's America was not primarily a military promise, though the military dimension was always present and always understood. The promise was something more fundamental and more seductive than weapons. It was the promise of abundance itself, the offer of a relationship with energy so transformed from the one that every previous human civilization had maintained, that the transformation would effectively remove from the human equation the single most limiting factor that history had always imposed on human ambition. Every civilization before the nuclear age had been constrained, at its most basic level, by the finite quantity of energy it could extract from its environment and the inefficient methods by which that extraction was accomplished. Wood burned and was consumed. Coal was dug and eventually depleted. Oil was pumped from formations that had taken geological time to accumulate and that human industry was capable of exhausting within generations. Each of these energy sources had powered genuine civilizational achievement, had made possible genuine expansion of human capability and human welfare, and each of them had carried within the nature of its finitude the seeds of the crisis that its exhaustion would eventually produce. Nuclear power promised to end this story. The specific physics of fission and the theoretical promise of fusion described a relationship with energy so different from every previous arrangement that the people who understood the physics in the years immediately following the Second World War were not wrong to feel that they were standing at the threshold of something genuinely new in human history. A pound of fissile material contained energy equivalent to millions of pounds of coal. The raw material for nuclear fuel, while not unlimited, was sufficiently abundant relative to its energy yield that the constraints which had defined every previous energy regime seemed to dissolve in the presence of the new technology. The promise was not simply of more energy, but of energy of a different order energy, sufficient to power a civilization without the perpetual anxiety about depletion that had haunted every previous civilization's relationship with the resources that kept it running. In Fallout's America, this promise was taken seriously in a manner and to a degree that transformed not just the energy sector, but the entire texture of the civilization. Nuclear power plants became the foundation of the electrical grid, replacing the coal and oil and hydroelectric generation that had previously served this function. This transformation was significant, but not transformative in itself. It was the extension of nuclear power into domains beyond the generation of electricity that made the pre-war world genuinely different from anything that had preceded it. Nuclear reactors small enough to fit inside automobiles replaced the internal combustion engine on American highways, creating a transportation system whose relationship with fuel was entirely unlike the one our own world had developed. Nuclear-powered appliances filled the kitchens and utility rooms of American homes. The familiar domestic spaces of refrigerator and washing machine and water heater reimagined with atomic hearts beating quietly behind their enamel exteriors. The visual and material culture that this transformation produced is one of the most recognizable features of the pre-war world and one of the most revealing. The Mr. Handy robot, floating on its trio of thruster jets with its multiple articulated arms and its cheerfully synthetic voice, was not simply a technological achievement, it was a cultural statement, an expression of what the civilization believed about itself and about the relationship between human beings and the technology they had created. The decision to give a household robot a personality, to design it for warmth and reassurance and the specific social lubrication of domestic service, reflected a culture that had thought carefully about how technology should relate to the humans it served, that had arrived at conclusions that prioritized comfort and familiarity over the austere functionalism that a different set of values might have produced. General Atomics International built robots that made people feel at ease in their presence, that spoke with the cadences of good manners, and offered assistance with the disposition of someone genuinely pleased to provide it. The technology was extraordinary. The cultural assumptions embedded in the technology were perhaps more revealing than the technology itself. Nuka-Cola occupied a similar position in the material culture of the pre-war world, simultaneously a product and a document, a thing that people consumed for the pleasure it provided, and a thing that tells the historian, examining it, everything essential about the civilization that produced it. The Nuka-Cola Corporation had built its beverage into an institution across the decades of the pre-war period, developing new flavors and new marketing campaigns and new physical presentations of the product with the relentless institutional energy of a company that understood it was selling not just a drink, but an experience, an identity, a relationship with a brand that had become so embedded in the daily texture of American life that choosing a Nuka-Cola from the machine in the lobby was not a purchasing decision, but a habitual gesture, as automatic and as culturally loaded as any other ritual of ordinary life. The fact that Nuka-Cola's original formula contained trace amounts of a mildly radioactive isotope strontium-90, incorporated during the development of the quantum variant that would become one of the brand's most distinctive products, tells a story that the pre-war marketing apparatus preferred to tell differently. The radiation was not a secret exactly. It was a detail that existed in the technical documentation that was known to the regulatory bodies that had assessed and approved the product for sale, that was present in the scientific literature in ways that anyone looking for it could find. What the marketing apparatus did with this detail was not suppress it, but reframe it, transform a potential liability into a feature, position the radioactive content not as a contaminant, but as a quality, something that distinguished Nuka-Cola Quantum's distinctive blue glow and elevated energy delivery from the ordinary products of its competitors. The reframing worked because it was conducted within a culture that had already absorbed nuclear technology as a positive presence, that associated atomic energy with the best aspirations of the civilization rather than with its dangers, that had been prepared by decades of atomic optimism to receive the information that their favorite beverage contained trace radioactivity as interesting and perhaps even desirable rather than alarming. The weapons dimension of nuclear civilization was never separate from its civilian face, never cleanly partitioned into a domain that the ordinary citizen could ignore while going about the business of daily life. The bombs were always there. They had always been there since the first detonations in the 1940s, present at the foundation of the nuclear age in its most destructive form, before any of the peaceful applications had been developed, and their presence had never been forgotten by the people who built the civilization or by the civilization's geopolitical opponents. The deterrence architecture that kept the bombs from being used in the decades of the resource wars was a sophisticated construction, a system of mutual assured destruction predicated on the rational calculation that no political objective was worth the cost of triggering a response that would reduce the triggering party to ash, that the threat of annihilation was more useful than annihilation itself, and would remain more useful as long as the parties capable of delivering annihilation remained rational actors capable of making the relevant calculation correctly. This architecture had worked, insofar as it had prevented nuclear exchange for the entire duration of the pre-war period. The bombs had not fallen on American cities during the resource wars, despite those wars escalating violence, and despite the pressures that resource competition was placing on every institution and relationship within the resource wars. International system, the deterrence held, and the holding of it created its own specific form of complacency, the assumption that because it had always held, because every crisis had thus far been navigated without crossing the threshold of nuclear exchange, the threshold was effectively uncrossable, that the system which had kept the peace would continue to keep it regardless of the accumulating stresses being applied to it. What the atomic dream ultimately cost the civilization that had built itself around it was not simply the catastrophic accounting of October 23rd. The cost had been accumulating long before the bombs fell, in the specific blindnesses that the dream required and that the civilization had collectively learned to maintain. A culture organized around the benevolence of nuclear technology was structurally ill-equipped to confront the possibility that the technology's most significant legacy might be the weapons program that had always accompanied its peaceful applications, that the same physics which promised abundance had always simultaneously promised annihilation, and that the deterrence architecture, which had prevented annihilation for decades, was not a permanent condition but a contingent one, dependent on the continued rationality of actors whose rationality the resource wars were systematically compromising. The atomic dream was genuine. The people who built it and lived within it were not fools or villains for having believed in it. They were people who had been given genuine reason to believe, who had seen genuine miracles produced by nuclear technology, who had watched atomic power transform the daily texture of their lives in ways that were mostly improvements on what had preceded them, who had no reliable way to know from inside the dream that the dream had a cost that had not yet come due. The cost arrived, as costs that have been deferred always arrive, all at once and without adequate warning, in the form of mushroom clouds rising above cities that had believed, with every reason available to them, that the morning of October 23rd would be the same as every other morning that had preceded it. The organizations that built and managed the pre-war world were not simply economic actors pursuing profit within a framework of law and democratic oversight, though they were also that. They were power structures, in the fuller sense of the term, entities whose resources, capabilities, and institutional reach gave them the ability to shape the conditions within which law was written and democratic decisions were made, to influence the trajectory of the civilization in directions that served their interests, while presenting that influence as the natural and beneficial operation of markets and expertise and the specialized knowledge that large institutions develop through sustained engagement with complex problems. Vault-Tec Corporation, General Atomics International, Robco Industries, the Nuka-Cola Corporation, Poseidon Energy, Westtech, the roster of the pre-war period's major corporate actors, reads like an inventory of the civilization's most essential functions. Each corporation occupying a domain so central to ordinary American life that its absence would have been felt immediately and profoundly by every citizen who depended on the products and services and infrastructure it provided. This dependence was not accidental. It was the accumulated result of decades of development in which corporate capability had expanded into domains that had previously been supplied by smaller and more distributed actors, or by public institutions, or by the natural organization of communities around shared needs. The consolidation was not experienced as loss, it was experienced as improvement, as the replacement of less reliable and less sophisticated provision with the products of organizations that had the resources to do things properly, to invest in research and quality and the specific refinements that distinguish a civilization's best material culture from its adequate one. The American federal government, in the pre-war period, was not separate from these corporate structures, but was deeply intertwined with them through the mechanisms of procurement, regulation, and the revolving relationship between public service and private employment that had characterized American governance since at least the mid-20th century. The contracts that funded Vault-Tec's shelter program, Westtech's power armor research, Robco's military robotics development, and Poseidon Energy's fuel production connected the government's most urgent priorities to the corporate sector's most profitable opportunities in ways that made it genuinely difficult to determine, in any specific case, whether a given policy decision had been made in the public interest or in the interest of the private actors who stood to benefit from it. The answer was often that both were served simultaneously, which was the most useful answer from the perspective of the people making the decisions, since it allowed them to act on private interest while maintaining the genuine belief that public interest was also being served. The Enclave occupied a different position in this power structure, not a corporation exactly, not a government agency exactly, but something that had grown within and between both categories across the decades of the pre-war period, accreting power and resources and personnel from the highest levels of both corporate and governmental life, developing its own institutional identity and its own understanding of its purpose that was distinct from any of the formal institutions it had grown within. The people who constituted the Enclave understood themselves as the custodians of America's essential character, the people whose wealth and capability and foresight had positioned them to ensure that whatever happened to the code, ordinary population, whatever catastrophe the world's deteriorating geopolitical situation might ultimately produce, the core of what made America worth preserving would survive. This understanding justified the resources they devoted to private preparations for scenarios that the public was not informed were being planned for. The construction of facilities and the stockpiling of capabilities that were organized around a view of the future that the Enclave's members held with the conviction of people who had access to information that confirmed their worst expectations. The propaganda apparatus that the pre-war government maintained was not a crude instrument of coercion, but a sophisticated system for managing the relationship between what the government knew and what the population was permitted to. Developed and refined across the decades of the resource wars. with the specific care that an institution devotes to tools it depends on for its continued functioning. The newsreels and the radio programs and the government-issued information materials that filled the media landscape of the pre-war period were not simply lies, though they contained lies. They were more precisely a curated version of reality, shaped by the selection of what to emphasize and what to omit, and how to frame what was presented in ways that produced in the audience a model of the world that was compatible with continued trust in the institutions producing the model. The citizens who lived within this information environment were not simply dupes. They were people navigating a situation that every citizen in every complex society navigates, in which the information available to any individual is necessarily incomplete, and the frameworks provided by trusted institutions necessarily shape how available information is understood. Some of them understood clearly that the official account of the world was a managed one, and maintained their skepticism with the quiet persistence of people who have learned that skepticism without power to act on it is a private posture rather than a public position. Others accepted the official account with the genuine trust of people who had no particular reason to doubt institutions that had, by most available measures, served them reasonably well across the course of their lifetimes. Most occupied the complicated middle ground, aware that the picture was incomplete, uncertain about how incomplete, and carrying that uncertainty without allowing it to become the organizing principle of a daily life that had other demands on its attention. What this power structure ultimately meant for the civilization it governed was a society whose genuine strengths and genuine achievements were inseparable from the specific vulnerabilities that its organizational form had created. The corporations that built extraordinary things also built the conditions in which those things would be used for purposes that the builders could have foreseen, and sometimes did foresee, and chose not to prioritize over the more immediate returns that alternative applications provided. The government that funded the research and maintained the infrastructure also managed the information environment in ways that prevented the population from fully understanding the situation their civilization was in. The enclave that prepared for catastrophe did so in ways that served the enclave's continuity more completely than they served the broader civilization's survival. All of this was the pre-war world doing what pre-war worlds do, not failing to be what it should have been, but being precisely what its own history had made it, with all the consequences that entailed. The year 2052 arrived in Fallout's America with the specific quality of a threshold that has been visible from a distance for long enough that its arrival feels simultaneously inevitable and somehow still surprising, the way that long-anticipated events always manage to arrive before the people expecting them feel fully ready to receive them. The Resource Wars, the name by which history would remember the conflicts that consumed the final quarter century of the pre-war world, did not begin on a single day or with a single decision. They were not declared. They were not initiated by any moment of dramatic rupture that contemporaries could point to and say, here is where it changed, here is where the world we knew ended, and the world that would end us began. They accumulated, as catastrophes of this kind always accumulate, through the compounding of decisions, each of which appeared in isolation to be a reasonable response to the specific pressures of the specific moment, and whose collective trajectory only became legible as catastrophic when enough of them had been made. That reversing course would have required a different civilization than the one making the decisions. The underlying condition that made the resource wars possible and then inevitable was one that the pre-war world scientists and economists had been documenting for decades, with the patient specificity of people who understood that data in sufficient quantities and presented with sufficient clarity eventually compels attention, even from people whose interests are served by not attending to it. The planet's accessible fossil fuel reserves the oil and natural gas that the global economy depended on for transportation, heating, chemical production, and the 100 other industrial applications that made the material abundance of the mid-21st century possible, were depleting at rates that the extraction technology of the era was accelerating rather than moderating. The projections varied in their specific timelines, but not in their direction. The world was consuming a finite resource, faster than any realistic estimate of remaining reserves could sustain, and the mathematical endpoint of that consumption was a crisis of supply that would arrive regardless of any political decision made about how to respond to its approach. The European Commonwealth's conflict with the Middle Eastern oil-producing states, beginning in 2052, was the first major expression of this underlying condition in the form of open warfare. The specific political details of the conflict, the negotiations that failed, the ultimatums that were delivered and rejected, the specific decisions made by specific leaders on specific days that produced the outbreak of fighting, were the surface expression of a pressure that had been building beneath the surface of international relations for years. The pressure of a civilization's most resource-intensive members, confronting the reality that the resources they depended on were controlled by parties who had their own understanding of what that control was worth and their own unwillingness to accept the prices that the consuming nation's urgency might otherwise have forced them to accept. The resource war between Europe and the Middle East was not Fallout's America's war, at least not initially, at least not directly. America watched from a position of relative distance, with its own resource challenges and its own diplomatic pressures and its own internal debates about the correct response to events in regions where American interests were real, but American direct involvement was, at the outset, a choice rather than a necessity. The watching produced its own specific effects on American domestic life, the anxiety that attaches to distant conflicts, when those conflicts involve resources whose importance is understood even if their geography is remote, the political debates about whether and how to engage, the beginning of the changes in ordinary daily life that resource pressure was already producing, regardless of the international context. The dissolution of the United Nations in 2053 was perhaps the most significant institutional event of the early resource wars period, more significant in its implications than any single military engagement, because it removed from the international system the one mechanism that had been designed specifically to provide an alternative to war as a method of resolving the kinds of disputes that the resource conflicts were generating. The United Nations had not been a perfect institution. It had never been a fully effective one. Its history contained as many failures as achievements, as many moments in which the competing interests of its member states had prevented it from acting on the principles its charter asserted, as moments in which it had managed to serve those principles against the pressures working against. But its existence had represented at minimum the shared acknowledgement that there was a domain of international interaction that should be governed by something other than the unmediated competition of power, and its dissolution represented the withdrawal of that acknowledgement, the collective decision by the states that had constituted it, that the costs of maintaining the institution were no longer outweighed by the benefits it provided. The new plague of 2053 arrived simultaneously with the United Nations dissolution and the continuing expansion of the European Middle Eastern conflict, a pandemic of uncertain origin that killed thousands in its initial outbreak and generated the specific combination of public health crisis, economic disruption, and institutional strain that pandemics produce in societies already under pressure from other directions. The American government's response to the new plague was shaped by the same propaganda management that characterized its handling of the resource wars, more broadly emphasizing the competence and preparedness of official response, minimizing the information that would have produced public panic, presenting the situation as under control in terms that were not always supported by the available evidence. The plague was eventually contained, but the containing of it accelerated several institutional developments that were already underway: the expansion of federal emergency powers, the normalization of information management as a public health tool, the development of the West Tech Research Corporation's research into infectious disease in directions that would later be redirected toward military applications of a distinctly different character. What the resource wars looked and felt like from inside an ordinary American life in these early years was not the drama that the name suggests in retrospect. It was the gradual adjustment of daily experience to conditions that each individually seemed manageable and whose cumulative effect became apparent only over time. The price of fuel at the nuclear pump station climbing in increments that were each individually within the range of what a working family's budget could absorb, while the cumulative increase across several years represented a genuine restructuring of household economics. The news programs providing information about events in distant regions in terms that acknowledged the seriousness of the situation while maintaining the tone of confident management that the government's information apparatus had, developed into a fine art. The political debates about the resource wars occurring within a framework that accepted certain assumptions as settled, that America's access to the resources it needed was a legitimate national interest worth defending, that the methods being used to defend it were proportionate and appropriate, that the situation was being managed by capable people who had access to information that made their management trustworthy, even when its specific details were not publicly available. The fuel shortage arriving on American soil with sufficient force to produce visible changes in daily life rather than merely statistical changes in economic indicators was the moment when the resource wars became real to the population in the way that only personal experience makes things real. Cars sat in driveways on days when the fuel situation made discretionary driving an unjustifiable expense. Businesses altered their hours and their operations in response to energy costs that the previous decade's pricing had not prepared them for. The government introduced rationing programs, initially presented as temporary and voluntary, gradually becoming more comprehensive and more mandatory, that transformed the relationship between ordinary Americans and the resources they had come to regard as permanently available in any quantity they chose to consume. The world was changing. Most of the people inside it understood that something significant was underway, even if the specific mechanics of what was underway and where it was heading remained obscured by the information environment in which they received their understanding of events. The atomic dream had promised abundance without limit. The limit was arriving. The promise was being revised in the specific, incremental way that institutions revise promises they cannot keep, not through direct acknowledgement of the revision, but through the slow adjustment of expectations, the gradual normalization of less, the replacement of the abundance that had been promised with the management of scarcity, dressed in the language of shared sacrifice and national purpose, and the specific pride that a civilization takes in its own resilience when the lane alternative to pride is the confrontation of what the situation actually means. The war that Fallout's America fought for Alaska, beginning in 2066, was the largest and most consequential military engagement of the Resource Wars period. The conflict that more than any other shaped the character of the pre-war military establishment and the specific forms of technology and trauma that the war years produced. It was also the most direct collision between the resource logic that was driving the conflicts and the American civilization's understanding of its own purposes, a collision that the government's propaganda apparatus managed with considerable skill, but could not entirely prevent from revealing something about the nature of what was being fought for and why. China's decision to invade Alaska was not irrational from within the framework of resource competition that the decade of the resource wars had established as the dominant logic of international relations. The Alaskan oil fields represented one of the last significant untapped petroleum reserves in a world that had been pumping oil with industrial efficiency for over a century. And China's own resource situation by 2066 had reached a level of genuine criticality that made the calculation of strategic risk look different than it would have looked to a less desperate actor. The invasion was a gamble, a calculation that the military benefit of securing Alaskan oil outweighed the political and military costs of the American response that would inevitably follow, and like most gambles made from positions of genuine desperation, it was a gamble whose odds looked better from inside the desperation than from outside it. America's entry into the active defense of Alaska produced in the domestic population the specific psychological effect that direct attack has always produced in nations that have not been directly attacked within living memory: a galvanizing clarity, a sudden sharpening of the narrative of the conflict from the complex and distant business of the resource wars into something that could be understood and responded to with the vocabulary of the unambiguous. The homeland invaded, the nation's territory violated, the call to defense that cuts through political complexity and produces the unified response that political complexity usually prevents. The government's information apparatus had been working toward this kind of clarity for years, managing the resource war's more ambiguous aspects with the careful language of national interest and strategic necessity, and the Alaskan invasion gave it material that required no management because it was, on its most basic terms, exactly what it appeared to be. The Alaskan front established itself as the defining theater of the conflict with a swiftness that the geography of the region shaped as much as any tactical decision on either side. The terrain of Alaska, its mountains, its winter conditions, the specific difficulties of sustaining supply lines across the distances involved, imposed constraints on both the American defense and the Chinese advance that transformed what might, in a more accessible theater, have been a campaign of movement into the grinding, attritional conflict that the Alaskan War became known for. Soldiers on both sides dug into positions that the winter made simultaneously essential and miserable, conducting operations whose tempo was determined as much by the weather and the supply situation as by tactical opportunity, developing in the process the specific institutional experience of sustained attritional warfare that would shape the American military's understanding of itself and its capabilities for the remainder of the pre-war period. The technological response that the Alaskan War produced was among the most consequential developments of the entire pre-war period, more significant in its long-term implications than any single battle or campaign. West Tech Research Corporation had been working on the concept of powered infantry armor since the early years of the Sino-American conflict, developing the theoretical framework for placing individual soldiers inside mechanical exoskeletons that would amplify their physical capability, protect them from conventional weapons, and allow them to operate effectively in the kinds of extreme environmental conditions that the Alaskan theater presented in abundance. The T-45 power armor that first reached the Alaskan front in the middle years of the conflict was not the final or most sophisticated expression of this technology. Subsequent iterations would improve its capability, its reliability, and its operational flexibility in ways that made each successive model a genuinely different proposition from its predecessor. But the T-45 was the proof that the concept worked, the demonstration that an individual soldier in powered armor was a qualitatively different kind of combatant than an individual soldier without it, capable of carrying weapons and absorbing punishment in ways that conventional infantry simply could not match. The power armor's impact on the Alaskan front was tactical and psychological in roughly equal measure. Tactically, units equipped with the T-45 could assault positions and sustain fire that would have been suicidal for conventional infantry, hold ground against Chinese forces that had no equivalent capability, and operate in the Alaskan winter conditions with an effectiveness that the armor's environmental systems made possible, where unassisted human physiology could not sustain it. Psychologically, the power armor announced something about American technological ambition and institutional capability that the government understood immediately and exploited comprehensively. It was a statement in metal and servo motors that America's industrial and scientific establishment could produce solutions to military problems that exceeded anything the opposition could field, that the nation's capacity for technological innovation was a strategic asset as significant as its manpower or its geography. Operation Anchorage, the American campaign to retake the Alaskan territory that the initial Chinese advance had secured, was the military success that the power armor had made possible and that the government had been building. The political and logistical foundation for across the years of the initial defensive phase. The campaign's success was genuine and its military significance real. The Chinese forces in Alaska were broken, their supply lines cut, their ability to sustain the occupation eliminated by an American offensive that combined the power armor's individual effectiveness with the operational planning of a military establishment that had spent years learning the specific demands of the Alaskan theater. The victory was complete enough that China's position in Alaska became untenable. The occupation that had begun the conflict ended, and the American government received the military vindication it needed to justify the costs the war had imposed on the domestic population. The war's expansion to the Chinese mainland American forces crossing the Pacific to engage on Chinese soil represented the escalation that the Alaskan campaign's success had made possible, and that the resource logic of the conflict made, from the American government's perspective, strategically necessary. Containing China's capacity to threaten American resource interests required more than the recovery of lost territory. It required the degradation of the Chinese military and industrial capability that had made the Alaskan invasion possible. The soldiers who fought in China carried with them the institutional memory of the Alaskan War and the specific moral confidence that victory in a defensive campaign produces. And they found themselves applying that confidence in a theater where the moral geometry was considerably more ambiguous, where the population being engaged was not an invading force, but a nation's own citizens, where the definition of legitimate military target expanded with the pressures of a campaign conducted far from home against an enemy fighting on its own ground. The veterans who returned from Alaska and from China carried with them things that the pre-war American society was not fully equipped to receive or process. The specific experience of the power armor fighting inside a machine that amplified your physical capability while simultaneously creating a degree of separation between your body and the immediate physical consequences of combat, produced psychological effects that the military's medical establishment was still in the process of understanding when the bombs fell, and rendered the question permanently unanswerable in any clinical sense. The experience of occupation, of maintaining military presence in a civilian environment, of conducting the operations that resource warfare required against populations that were its indirect victims rather than its direct combatants. This too produced consequences that returned to America in the psychological states of the people who had lived through it, consequences that the Veterans Affairs apparatus tried to manage, and that the propaganda apparatus tried to frame in terms that preserved the war's heroic narrative, while acknowledging that service came at a cost. The home front during the years of the Sino-American War was not the unified and cheerful home front of the government's preferred imagery, though it was also not the site of the kind of mass opposition that previous American wars had generated. It was something more complicated than either a population living with the specific mixture of genuine patriotism and genuine exhaustion and genuine uncertainty that prolonged conflict produces in societies that had not chosen war as their preferred condition, that found in the daily obligations of wartime life both the solidarity of shared purpose and the weariness of being asked to sustain that solidarity across years that kept requiring more of it without producing the resolution that would have made the requiring feel worthwhile. The draft, the rationing, the information environment, the specific social pressures that wartime America applied to the expression of doubt about the war's purposes or methods. All of these shaped the pre-war world's final years in ways that the wasteland's ruins preserve, though the preservation is necessarily incomplete, necessarily the record of things, rather than the record of the experience of living among those things when they were new and the world they inhabited had not yet ended. The texture of daily life in pre-war America is perhaps the most difficult thing to recover with full fidelity from the evidence the wasteland preserves, and it is, in some respects, the most important. The ruins tell us what the civilization built. The terminals tell us what the civilization recorded. The holotapes tell us what individuals chose to say when they knew they were speaking for a record. But the texture of daily life, the quality of an ordinary afternoon, the specific weight of an ordinary Tuesday, the unremarkable accumulation of small experiences that constituted the substance of what most people's lives actually were. This is precisely what ruins and records and chosen statements cannot fully preserve, because it was never primarily a thing that anyone thought to document. It was simply what life was, and life did not require documentation because it was continuously present, continuously available, not yet something that needed to be preserved against the possibility of its absence. The suburban home of the pre-war period was the civilization's most characteristic architectural expression and its most revealing cultural artifact simultaneously. The specific form that American domestic life had developed across the decades of the mid-20th century, the detached single-family house on its plot of managed lawn, the kitchen with its array of labor-saving appliances, the living room organized around the television set that delivered the culture's shared content into the private space of the family, had been refined and elaborated and made more technically sophisticated across the following century without being fundamentally reconceived. Nuclear-powered appliances replaced their earlier counterparts without changing the domestic arrangements those appliances served. Robots, like the Mr. Handy, supplemented human domestic labor without transforming the understanding of what domestic life was for or what it was supposed to produce. The suburban home of 2077 was in many essential respects recognizable to someone who had lived in a suburban home of 1957, not because no change had occurred, but because the changes that had occurred were elaborations rather than reconceptions, improvements within a framework rather than replacements of it. This continuity was not stagnation. It is important to resist the reading that understands the pre-war world's aesthetic persistence as evidence of a civilization that had run out of imagination or lost its capacity for genuine innovation. The people who lived in the pre-war world were not living in a museum of the 1950s. They were living in their present, which happened to have developed from the 1950s, along a path that preserved more of that era's visual and organizational vocabulary than our own world's development did. The nuclear family, in its split-level ranch house, with its robot servant and its nuclear-powered car in the driveway, was not performing a historical reenactment. It was expressing the genuine values and aspirations of a civilization that had arrived at this configuration through its own authentic developmental history, and that found in this configuration a form of life that felt, by and large, like what a good life ought to feel like. Nuka-Cola's presence in this daily texture went beyond the product itself, though the product was genuinely ubiquitous in ways that even the most thorough market penetration in our own world's beverage industry would find difficult to match. The Nuka-Cola machine was a fixture of the pre-war landscape with the thoroughness that made it invisible in the way that truly integrated environmental features become invisible present in the lobbies of office buildings, and the break rooms of factories, and the corners of gas stations, and the waiting areas of every institution that understood that providing a cold Nuka-Cola to someone waiting for something was a small act of hospitality that cost almost nothing and produced a measurable improvement in the waiting person's relationship with the institution that had provided it. The brand's color scheme, the red and white of its classic presentation, the specific electric blue of its quantum variant, became part of the visual grammar of public space in the way that only the most successfully embedded commercial presences achieve. Not an intrusion on the environment, but a component of it, expected and in its way reassuring, one of the signals that said this is a normal place where normal things happen. The entertainment culture of the pre-war period was rich in ways that the wasteland's surviving holotapes and terminal entries only partially capture, because the most significant forms of entertainment were experienced in real time, rather than recorded for later access, were shared events, rather than preserved documents. The television programming that filled the evening hours of pre-war American households was produced within the specific constraints of a media environment shaped by corporate ownership, government relationship, and the institutional culture that sustained both, which meant that it was simultaneously genuinely entertaining, created by people with real skill and real creative investment in their work, and organized around assumptions about what its audience should believe and feel and aspire to, that aligned closely with the assumptions of the institutions that owned the channels and influenced the content. Situation comedies explored the pleasures and conflicts of domestic life in ways that affirmed the domestic arrangements the civilization had settled on as its preferred form. Adventure serials celebrated American military and technological capability in terms that the government's information apparatus would have designed itself if it had thought to. The news programs presented the world in frames that the news organization's corporate relationships and government adjacency had shaped into reliable producers of the kind of understanding that maintained public confidence in institutional competence. The people who consumed this culture were not simply passive recipients of its ideological content. They brought their own experiences and their own skepticisms and their own capacity for distinguishing between what a program was trying to say and what they themselves believed. And many of them maintained throughout their engagement with the pre-war media landscape a private distance from its more obvious promotional dimensions. But culture works on people in ways that operate below the level of conscious critical engagement, shaping the questions that feel natural to ask and the answers that feel natural to accept. And the pre-war culture's sustained presentation of a specific version of American life and American purpose had effects on its audience's understanding of themselves and their world that no amount of private skepticism could fully insulate against. Religion and community occupied the spaces in pre-war American life that organized religion and community have always occupied in human societies. The provision of meaning, the articulation of values, the maintenance of the social bonds that make individuals members of something larger than themselves, the specific comfort that shared belief and shared practice provide to people facing the uncertainties that individual existence inevitably generates. The pre-war period's religious landscape was diverse in the way that American religious life had always been diverse, encompassing everything from the mainstream denominations of Protestant Christianity to the Catholic communities that had maintained their institutional presence across centuries, to the various smaller and more idiosyncratic religious expressions that a society with genuine religious freedom inevitably produces. What all of these shared, in the specific conditions of the pre-war period, was the challenge of providing meaning within a context that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain optimistic frameworks around the challenge of speaking convincingly about divine providence and human dignity and the farther, ultimate meaningfulness of ordinary life in the presence of information about what the resource wars and the Sino-American conflict and the depletion of the world's natural resources were producing in the lives of real people. The people who saw clearly, who understood, from within the pre-war civilization and with the analytical tools available within its information environment, that the trajectory of events was leading somewhere catastrophic, occupied a specific and difficult position. Scientists who published findings about resource depletion rates watched their work receive official acknowledgement and institutional inaction in roughly equal measure, their data accepted into the record without producing the policy responses that the data clearly indicated were necessary. Journalists who reported on the conditions of the resource conflicts and the methods being used to manage them found their work shaped by editorial environments whose relationship with the truth was mediated by the corporate, governmental relationships that sustained their publications. Citizens who arrived at accurate assessments of the situation through the accumulation of available evidence found themselves in the uncomfortable position of people who know something that their social environment has organized itself around not knowing, who must choose between the isolation of maintaining their assessment against the pressure of the consensus and the relief of allowing the consensus to reshape their understanding in more comfortable directions. What ordinary life felt like in the years immediately preceding the bombs is perhaps best approached through the specific quality of the things that survive the objects that the wasteland preserves, with the specific poignancy of things that outlasted the people who made and used them. The Nuka-Cola bottle on the kitchen counter of an abandoned home, still sealed, still containing its mildly irradiated contents, still displaying on its label the cheerful imagery that the corporation's marketing department had approved in the last years before the bombs. The holotape in the bedside table drawer, recorded by a parent for a child, discussing nothing more significant than the arrangements for a birthday party that would never occur. The textbook on a school desk, open to a chapter on American history that ends well before the history that is about to happen. These objects carry within them the texture of the daily life that surrounded them with more fidelity than any documentation could, because they are not representations of that life, but its actual physical residue, things that were ordinary when they were new, and that have become archaeological only in retrospect. Vault-Tec Corporation's public face was among the most carefully constructed presentations in the pre-war period's crowded landscape of institutional self-promotion, and this is saying something substantial given the sophistication of the competition. The company that sold nuclear shelter residences had a more complex persuasive challenge than any of its corporate peers, because its product required its customers to perform a specific psychological act that most human beings have strong reasons to resist: the sustained contemplation of civilizational catastrophe in sufficient detail to motivate a major purchasing decision. Buying a Nuka-Cola required no confrontation with mortality. Buying a vacuum cleaner with nuclear power cell technology required no acknowledgement that the world might end. Buying a vault residence required the customer to hold in mind, with enough specificity to make the product feel necessary, the possibility that the civilization they inhabited might be destroyed, and to transform that possibility from a source of paralyzing anxiety into the kind of manageable concern that motivates prudent preparation rather than existential despair. The Vault Boy was the solution to this persuasive problem, and as solutions go, it was extraordinarily effective. The cheerful mascot figure, thumb raised in the universal gesture of optimistic affirmation, round face arranged in an expression of uncomplicated happiness, rendered in the visual style of mid-century American illustration that combined the approachability of the familiar with the reassurance of the expertly designed, served as a constant assertion that the subject of nuclear war and underground shelter and civilizational catastrophe could be approached with the same breezy confidence that Americans brought to their relationship with every other technology the era had provided them. The Vault Boy did not acknowledge that nuclear war was terrifying. He acknowledged that it was a planning problem, a logistics challenge, a situation for which the prepared and forward-thinking American family had practical solutions available at reasonable prices from a reputable corporation that stood behind its products with the full weight of its institutional expertise and its government-contracted engineering capability. The vault numbering system, 122 vaults distributed across the continental United States, communicated its own reassuring message about the comprehensiveness of the program, the scale of the investment, the seriousness with which the corporation, and by extension the government it worked alongside, had approached the challenge of providing for the population's survival. The specific locations of individual vaults were not always publicly disclosed, for security reasons that the company explained with enough detail to be convincing and not enough to be verifiable. But the existence of the program was publicly known, and the general distribution of the vaults across the country was communicated in enough detail that any American family could believe, if they chose to, that a vault was accessible to them, and that the question of survival in a nuclear event was primarily a matter of taking the preparation seriously enough to act on it. The advertising materials that Vault-Tec produced across the years of the Vault program's development constitute among the most revealing documents of the pre-war period's specific relationship between institutional communication and reality. The pamphlets and posters and holographic displays that the corporation used to sell Vault residences depicted the underground life with a warmth and a specificity that suggested long and careful thought about what a customer needed to believe in order to feel that a Vault residence was a worthwhile investment. The common areas of the depicted vaults were spacious and well lit, organized around the domestic comforts that the suburban American home had established as the baseline expectation for comfortable living. The residents depicted within them were healthy, diverse, in the specific way that pre-war American advertising had developed into a visual convention, engaged in activities that communicated normalcy and community and the continuation of ordinary human life in the presence of the extraordinary circumstances that the vault was designed to manage. Children played games under the supervision of attentive parents. Couples shared meals in dining areas that bore more resemblance to the restaurants they had frequented on the surface than to the institutional feeding arrangements that the available space would more realistically have permitted. Scientists in white coats worked in well-equipped laboratories at the frontiers of the knowledge that would eventually allow the vault's population to return to the surface and rebuild. The reality of the vault program's actual architecture, the societal preservation program, the deliberate design of the vast majority of vaults as controlled experiments rather than genuine shelters, existed in a different document entirely, in the internal communications and the sealed research protocols and the classified annexes to the government contracts that funded the construction. The gap between the two documents was not simply the ordinary gap between advertising and product reality that operates in every consumer market. It was the gap between a promise made to people about their survival and a plan designed for purposes that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the specific questions that the researchers who designed the experiments found interesting. Each vault's experimental parameters represented a choice about what to study, and therefore a choice about what to do to the people being studied. A choice made by people who would not be in the vault when the experiment ran, and whose relationship with the subjects of their experiments was the relationship of designers to their test population rather than of a corporation to its primate, customers, or a government to its citizens. The range of vault experiments maps the imagination of the people who designed them in ways that are revealing in proportion to how carefully they are examined. Some experiments studied the obvious variables of isolated community, life, population size, resource allocation, the dynamics of authority in enclosed spaces. Others introduced specific environmental modifications that created conditions of artificial scarcity or artificial abundance. Studying how communities responded to the removal of resources that had previously been available, or to the provision of resources that exceeded what the vault's stated parameters would have permitted. Still, others introduced specific individuals into vault populations, people with particular psychological profiles or particular skills or particular ideological commitments, inserted into communities that did not know they contained a designed element, whose behavior the researchers monitoring the experiment expected to produce the specific social dynamics they wanted to study. The vaults that were genuine shelters, the small number designed without experimental parameters, intended to function as the advertising materials described all vaults as functioning, represent the moral complexity of the program in its most concentrated form. Their existence demonstrates that the people who designed the societal preservation program understood the difference between genuine shelter and experimental facility, that the choice to make most vaults experimental was a deliberate one rather than a function of practical necessity, that the resource constraints that might have forced a tragic compromise between shelter and experiment were not in fact the explanation for a program that chose experiment over shelter when it had the resources to provide both. The families who purchased vault residences and descended into the underground on October 23, 2077, did so in possession of whatever trust the corporation's advertising and the government's endorsement had built in them across the years of the program's public existence. They carried their most important possessions and their most essential memories and their most fundamental hopes about the future into spaces that most of them had never seen except in the promotional materials, and they sealed themselves inside those spaces with the faith of people who have been promised something and have no way to determine, from within the promise, whether the thing promised bears any meaningful relationship to what they are actually receiving. The northern border of the United States had always been the world's longest undefended frontier, a phrase that had functioned in the pre-war period as a statement of both geographical fact and cultural aspiration. The assertion that the relationship between America and Canada was of a kind that required no military presence to sustain, that the shared values and the shared history and the specific intimacy of neighboring peoples who had developed alongside each other across centuries of largely peaceful coexistence had produced a relationship of genuine mutual regard that made the machinery of national defense between them unnecessary. The annexation of Canada revised this aspiration in the specific terms that resource pressure and military logic applied to it, demonstrating that the undefended frontier had been possible as long as neither party had sufficiently compelling reasons to regard the other's territory as something that required taking, and that the resource wars had supplied exactly those reasons. The formal process by which Canada became part of the United States was conducted in the language of partnership and mutual benefit that the pre-war American government had developed into one of its most practiced institutional registers. The negotiations, if negotiations is the right word, for a process in which one party's military and economic power so exceeded the others that the outcomes were largely predetermined, produced documents that described the relationship between the two nations in terms that emphasized cooperation and shared interest, and the practical advantages of administrative integration for the management of shared resources that geographic proximity had, always made in some respects logically unified. The language was careful and the framing was consistent, and the result of the process was the incorporation of a sovereign nation's territory and population into the administrative structure of its neighbor without the formal declaration of conquest that the reality of the situation would more honestly have required. What the language obscured was visible enough to the Canadians who experienced it, which is to say, to the people for whom the annexation was not an administrative process occurring at the level of governments and legal instruments, but a lived reality occurring at the level of daily life in communities that had been Canadian and were now, by the operation of forces they had not chosen and could not reverse, something else. The soldiers who appeared in their towns were American soldiers. The administrators who arrived to manage the integration of Canadian institutions into American frameworks were American administrators. The directives that arrived from the new governing authority came from Washington rather than Ottawa, and they arrived with the expectation of compliance that American directives carried within the American administrative culture that had now extended its jurisdiction northward. Canadian resistance to the annexation took forms ranging from the organized and militant to the quiet and persistent, from the armed groups that conducted sabotage operations against American military and industrial targets, to the ordinary citizens who maintained in the privacy of their own understanding the assertion that their national identity had not been extinguished by the signature of documents in rooms they had not been invited to. The armed resistance was real and was treated by the American military establishment as a genuine security concern, requiring resources and attention and the specific operational methods that counterinsurgency demands from the military forces conducting it. The quiet resistance was perhaps more widespread and certainly more durable, persisting in the specific ways that cultural identity persists when the political structures that formally express it have been removed in language and in memory, and in the specific texture of community life that continued to know itself as something that the annexation had not managed to fully incorporate. The experience of American soldiers stationed in Canada as part of the occupation force reproduced in a northern setting the same moral and psychological dynamics that the Alaskan and Chinese campaigns had produced in their respective theaters. The orders that came down from command asked for the maintenance of order in conditions where the population's definition of order and the military's definition of order were not identical, where the resistance that justified increasingly harsh responses was itself a function of the conditions that the occupation had created, where the cycle of provocation and repression generated its own self-sustaining logic that bore less and less relationship to any political objective that could be clearly articulated. The soldiers who performed these functions were not, as individuals, distinguished from their fellow citizens by any particular quality of cruelty or moral indifference. They were people operating within an institutional framework that provided specific authorizations and specific expectations and specific consequences for failure to comply with both, and they responded to those institutional pressures in the ways that people generally respond to institutional pressures, with varying degrees of resistance and accommodation, with the specific moral accommodations that group identity and institutional loyalty and the practical demands of survival in a hostile environment combined to make easier than they would otherwise be. What the annexation of Canada revealed about the civilization that conducted it was something that the civilization's own self-understanding was not well equipped to receive. The America that had defined itself across its entire history in terms of the opposition between freedom and empire, between the self-determination of peoples and the impositions of distant authority, between the legitimate exercise of national power and the illegitimate subordination of one people to another's will, this America had produced, through the operation of its own institutional logic under sufficient pressure, something that its founding vocabulary could not describe without contradiction. The officials who administered the annexation were not hypocrites in any simple sense. They genuinely believed, most of them, that what they were doing served legitimate purposes and was justified by the circumstances that had made it necessary. The belief was sincere, and the circumstances were real, and the justification was genuinely available within the framework of values that the pre-war American establishment had developed for the management of exactly this kind of situation. The problem was that the framework of values had been constructed to justify things that the civilization's stated principles prohibited, and the construction was sophisticated enough that the people operating within it could maintain the prohibition and the justification simultaneously without experiencing the contradiction between them as requiring resolution. The population of Canada that was incorporated into the United States by the annexation numbered in the tens of millions and represented a diverse range of communities whose relationship with the American presence varied according to their specific circumstances, their proximity to the conflict's most active theaters, and the specific ways in which the occupation's requirements intersected with their daily lives. Some communities experienced the annexation primarily as an administrative change, with limited immediate effects on the texture of daily existence. The distant authority that governed their lives, changing its address without changing in any immediately visible way the local institutions through which governance actually operated. Others experienced it as a comprehensive transformation of their situation. As soldiers arrived and supply lines were redirected and local authorities were replaced by American administrators, and the specific intimacies of occupation made themselves felt in the daily negotiations of life in a territory that was now being managed for purposes that were not the purposes of the people living in it. The specific historical record of what was done in Canada during the annexation period exists in the wasteland primarily as fragments, terminal entries, and holotapes, and the physical evidence of events preserved in the specific way, that the nuclear catastrophe preserved things, removing from the landscape the people who might have continued the record while leaving intact many of the physical artifacts around which the record was organized. What can be reconstructed from these fragments is sufficient to establish the character of the annexation, without being sufficient to provide the comprehensive account that the full complexity of the experience deserved, and that the events of October 23rd effectively prevented from being written. The soldiers who served there carried their experiences with them into whatever came after, into the vaults, if they were among the ones who descended, into the wasteland, if they survived the initial exchange on the surface, into the specific forms that the pre-war civilization's unprocessed traumas took when the civilization that had produced them was no longer present to manage or contain or provide context for what they meant. The annexation stands in the pre-war timeline as the clearest single example of the distance between the civilization's values and its behavior, the most legible demonstration that the America of the resource wars had become something that the America of its founding documents could not have recognized as continuous with its own aspirations. This does not make it the most significant development of the pre-war period, the Vault program's hidden architecture, the Sino-American War's escalation, the depletion of the resources that the entire international system depended on, all had consequences that extended further and deeper into the civilization's trajectory. But it makes it the most revealing, the place where the pre-war world's self-understanding and its operational reality were most directly in contact with each other, and where the gap between them was most impossible to manage through the usual mechanisms of institutional language and information control. Canada knew what was happening to it. The soldiers who conducted the occupation knew, in whatever compartmentalized way, that institutional people know things that their institutions prefer not to have clearly articulated what they were doing. The administrators who wrote the documents in the careful language of partnership and mutual benefit knew that the language was doing a specific kind of work that the reality required it to do. And the civilization that contained all of these people continued to understand itself, in its most public and most official expressions, as a civilization committed to the principles that the annexation had violated. This was the pre-war world in the final decade of its existence, not a place that had abandoned its values, but a place whose values had been so thoroughly incorporated into institutional frameworks designed to sustain specific arrangements of power that the values had become available for deployment in the service of exactly the things they nominally prohibited. The bombs would fall on this world in a few years, and the wasteland would preserve its ruins with the impartial thoroughness of catastrophe, and the people who survived would carry forward into the new world the specific mixture of memory and loss and institutional inheritance that the old world had been building across its entire existence. The annexation of Canada was one piece of that inheritance, one of the things the old world had done that the new world would need to understand in order to have any chance of doing differently. If the new world ever arrived at a condition in which doing differently was something it had the capacity and the clarity to choose, the year 2076 arrived in what remained of the pre-war world's institutional consciousness with the quality of a number that everyone in the rooms where consequential decisions were made had been watching approach for longer than any of them would have found comfortable to acknowledge publicly. The trajectory that the resource wars had established across the preceding decade and a half had not improved. The diplomatic channels that might have produced a managed resolution to the resource crisis had not produced one. The military campaigns that had been justified in terms of securing the resources necessary for American civilizational continuity had secured some resources and consumed others, and had not addressed the underlying arithmetic of a world whose demand for finite materials continued to exceed the rate at which those materials could be extracted from a planet that had been extracting them with industrial efficiency for over a century. The people in those rooms understood this. The documents circulating among them said it clearly enough. in the language of projections and scenario analyses, and the specific kind of institutional communication that is designed to be accurate within its own distribution and deniable outside it. Understanding something and acting on the understanding are different capacities, and the gap between them in institutions of sufficient size and complexity and invested interest can become, under the right conditions, effectively infinite. The domestic situation in the United States in the final years before the bombs fell was shaped by the accumulated effects of years of wartime rationing, sustained propaganda, and the specific social pressures that a society at war applies to the expression of doubt about the purposes and methods of the war it is conducting. The population that had been galvanized by the Alaskan invasion and sustained through the long years of the Sino-American conflict by the government's information apparatus had not been fully restored to the pre-war condition of comfortable distance from the realities of the resource crisis, because the realities of the resource crisis were no longer the kind of thing that distance could be maintained from. The rationing that had begun as a wartime measure had become a structural feature of daily life, no longer experienced as a temporary sacrifice on the way to eventual restoration of normal conditions, but as the new normal itself, the baseline against which any improvement would be measured. The social fabric showed the specific strains that prolonged hardship applied to it, not the dramatic ruptures of a society in open crisis, but the quieter deterioration of trust and mutual obligation that occurs when people have been asked to sustain sacrifices that have not produced the promised results. When the institutional reassurances that the sacrifices are working and the situation is improving have been repeated often enough, that the gap between what the reassurances assert and what daily experience confirms has become too wide to bridge by any further repetition of the same reassurances. Communities maintain themselves, as communities do, through the mechanisms of mutual support and shared purpose that human social organization generates under pressure. But the maintenance required more effort than it had in more comfortable years, and the effort was unevenly distributed in the way that effort under pressure is always unevenly distributed, falling more heavily on the people with fewer resources and fewer options, and less institutional protection against the specific demands that the situation was making of everyone. The Vault program's final phases were conducted with the specific urgency of a project whose administrators understood, in ways that the general public was not fully informed of, that the timeline for completion had acquired a new character. The vaults that had been under construction or preparation in the years before 2076 were being finished with an acceleration that reflected the assessment being made in the offices, where the most sensitive projections were reviewed. Vault-Tech's relationship with the government had always involved an information asymmetry in which the corporation's access to the classified planning for nuclear contingencies gave it knowledge that its own customers did not possess, and that asymmetry had shaped the pace and the priorities of the Vault construction program in ways that anyone examining the timeline with full access to both the public and the classified record would have found revealing. The vaults were being completed because the people with access to the most accurate assessments of the geopolitical situation believed that the time remaining before those assessments became moot was shorter than the public communications about the situation acknowledged. The last vault sealings occurred in the weeks and months before October 23, 2077, as the families who had purchased residences received the notifications that their vault was ready and that the political situation had reached a threshold that the administrators determined warranted moving residents into the facility ahead of schedule. The experience of descending into a vault in those final weeks of leaving the surface world behind while the surface world still stood, while the ordinary business of daily life was still being conducted above the shelter's sealed door, had a specific quality that the holotapes recording individual accounts of the experience convey with an honesty that the official communications of the period do not. People knew and did not know simultaneously. in the specific way that human psychology manages the gap between information that has been received and conclusions that the receiving mind is not ready to fully accept. They knew that the situation was serious enough that they were going underground. They did not know, or did not fully allow themselves to know, that they were going underground for the last time, that the world they were leaving behind as a temporary measure was a world they would not see again. The people who remained on the surface in the final weeks before the bombs, the majority of the population, since the vaults could accommodate only a fraction of the American people, and were not equally accessible across the geographic and economic distribution of the population, continued their lives with the specific quality of IDs. Continuation that characterizes human existence, even in the presence of information that suggests continuation may not be available much longer. The schools were still open, the diners were still serving, the Nuka-Cola machines were still humming in the corners of the spaces they had occupied for years, dispensing their product to people who fed caps into the slot with the automatic gesture of the habitual and received their bottles with the automatic pleasure of the familiar. The government's information apparatus was still producing its managed version of the situation's severity, calibrated to prevent panic without crossing into the territory of reassurance, so complete that it would prevent the behaviors the government needed the population to perform in the event that events moved faster than any official communication could accommodate. What was known privately, in the rooms where the classified projections lived, was that the geopolitical situation had reached a point at which the deterrence architecture that had prevented nuclear exchange throughout the resource wars and the Sino-American conflict was operating under stresses that its designers had not fully anticipated, and that its ongoing function could not be guaranteed with the confidence that its ongoing function required. The logic of mutual assured destruction depended on the rationality of the actors it constrained, on the reliable calculation by all relevant parties that no achievable objective was worth the cost of nuclear exchange. The resource wars had spent a decade and a half applying systematic pressure to that rationality, creating conditions in which the calculations were being made by institutions under the specific kind of pressure that makes the calculation of what is worth what progressively more difficult to perform with the detached precision that deterrence theory assumed. The bombs had not fallen because the deterrence held. The deterrence held because the bombs had not fallen. These two statements had been functionally equivalent across the entire pre-war period. The question being asked in the classified rooms in the final months was whether they would continue to be equivalent, and the answers coming back from the analysis were not reassuring. October 22nd, 2077 was, in almost every external respect, a day like the days that had preceded it. The sun came up over the pre-war landscape with the indifference that suns bring to all mornings regardless of what the mornings contain. People performed the rituals of beginning that have characterized human mornings across the entire span of recorded history: the preparation of food, the management of children, the negotiation of the day's demands with the day's available energy, the specific texture of departure from home into the world that daily life requires. Cars moved on the streets, their nuclear engines operating with the quiet efficiency that the technology had achieved across decades of refinement. The radio programs played in kitchens and in the vehicles of commuters, delivering the morning's information in the managed tones that the government's media relationship had established as the appropriate register for the communication of a situation that was serious without being, officially, cause for alarm. In some homes, the morning had a quality different from its ordinary character in ways that the people living through it could not have articulated precisely, but that retrospective accounts, from the small number of people who survived the following day and eventually recorded their memories of this one, describe with a consistency that suggests the quality was real rather than retrospectively imposed, a sense of weight in the ordinary, a particular attention to the specific details of the familiar, the way the light fell through the kitchen window, the sound of a child's voice, the temperature of coffee in a particular cup. Whether this was genuine premonition or the retrospective construction of significance from a day that became significant only after the event that followed it, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. Human memory is not a reliable recorder, but the accounts exist, and they share enough in their character to suggest that something about the last full day of the pre-war world communicated itself to the people living within it in ways that their ordinary relationship with ordinary days had not prepared them to process. The diplomatic record of October 22nd tells a story that the public communications of the day do not. The final messages exchanged between governments in the hours before the bombs fell reflect the specific texture of a situation that had moved past the point at which communication could produce the results communication was supposed to produce, in which the exchanges taking place were performing the formal requirements of diplomatic engagement, while the decisions that would make those requirements irrelevant were being made at levels and through processes that the diplomatic channels did not reach, ultimatums that could not be accepted, assurances that could not be believed. The specific quality of communication between parties who understand that they are communicating but are no longer certain that communication can change anything. The morning of October 23rd, 2077 began as mornings do. This is one of the most important and most difficult facts about it to hold clearly in mind, that it began ordinarily, that the people who would not survive it woke into it with the ordinary expectations of people who have woken into many ordinary mornings and have no particular reason to expect that this one will be different. Breakfast was prepared in kitchens across the country, children dressed for school, workers prepared for the commute that the morning's routines required. The accumulated ordinary machinery of daily life engaged itself with the automatic efficiency of systems that have been running long enough that they operate without requiring conscious activation. The first detonations were not announced. There was no warning system adequate to the speed at which the exchange unfolded. No interval between the decision to launch and the arrival of the consequences sufficient to allow the ordinary morning to be interrupted by anything that could have changed what the morning would become. The bombs fell on the cities, first the population centers, whose elimination was the first priority of targeting logic designed to remove an opponent's capacity for political and military cohesion. Washington, New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, the great population centers of the American civilization, received the bombs that had always been addressed to them with a directness and a completeness that the deterrence architecture had spent decades preventing, and that the deterrence architecture's final failure delivered with the efficiency of a system that had been designed for exactly this purpose and had been maintained in operational readiness throughout the entire period during which it was simultaneously being used to prevent this purpose from being realized. The electromagnetic pulse arrived first across the regions affected by the initial detonations, the signature of nuclear weapons, whose designers had understood that a civilization's electrical infrastructure was among its most consequential vulnerabilities and had incorporated the disabling of that infrastructure into the weapon's effects through deliberate design. Vehicles stopped on the roads where they had been operating moments before. Radios cut to silence in the middle of whatever they had been broadcasting. The electrical systems that sustained the ordinary texture of modern life, the refrigerators and the heating systems, and the communication networks, and the traffic control systems, and the 10,000 other applications of electricity that the pre-war world had built into the fabric of its daily function, ceased to operate simultaneously across the affected regions, their cessation arriving without warning and with the completeness that electromagnetic pulse delivers when it is generated at sufficient scale. For the people in the areas where the pulse arrived without the direct effects of the blast, there was a moment brief, measured in seconds of disorientation without understanding. The car that stopped, the radio that went silent, the domestic appliances that ceased their operation mid-cycle. In this moment, before the light arrived, people looked around at the stilled world and tried to understand what had happened to it, tried to fit the experience into frameworks that the frameworks available to them were not adequate to contain. Then the light came. The thermal pulse of a nuclear detonation at distance is not the experience of light in any ordinary sense. It is a phenomenon for which human perceptual experience provides no adequate preparation, an intensity of radiant energy that arrives faster than the sound that will follow it, that penetrates closed eyelids and covering hands with the ease of something that was never designed to be stopped by barriers so inadequate to its nature. People who survived the initial exchange in areas outside the direct blast radius, and who later recorded accounts of what they experienced in the first seconds, described the light consistently the way it seemed to come from. Everywhere simultaneously, the way its intensity exceeded any reference point that previous experience provided, the way it lasted long enough to register as more than an instant, while being briefer than any experience of duration that the word light normally suggests. The heat followed the light with the immediacy of things that travel together at velocities that human scale cannot distinguish. The air transformed in the passage of the thermal wave, carrying across the landscape the temperature of a process occurring miles away with a directness that the distance could attenuate but not eliminate. People who had been outdoors when the bombs fell experienced the thermal pulse as a physical impact, not the sharp impact of a blow, but the comprehensive impact of an environment that had in a moment become something that the human body was not designed to inhabit. Windows that had been ordinary glass became sources of secondary injury as the thermal energy reached them, and the pressure wave that followed exploited the damage the heat had produced. The sound arrived last, which is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the experience for those who have not encountered it directly and who know nuclear detonations primarily through the imagery of the mushroom cloud's visual drama. The visual information traveled at the speed of light and arrived essentially instantaneously. The thermal energy traveled at the speed of radiant heat and arrived almost as quickly. The sound traveled at the speed of sound and arrived in the seconds that followed, which meant that people in certain locations experienced the light and the heat and had time to understand that something nuclear had occurred before the sound reached them, a specific quality of anticipatory, knowing that the time. Accounts describe as among the most disorienting aspects of the experience, the period between the visual and thermal information and the acoustic confirmation, during which the mind was processing an event whose full nature had not yet been delivered. The mushroom clouds that rose above the American cities on the morning of October 23rd did not rise over empty ground. They rose over places where people had been living their ordinary lives minutes before, over kitchens and offices and schools and diners and all the other spaces that the pre-war civilization had built for the conduct of its daily existence. The fires that followed the initial detonations consumed what the blast had not, and the fires were followed by the fallout that the atmospheric processing of nuclear material and the particulate matter of destroyed cities and the radioactive products of fission that the weapons designers had always known would settle back to Earth in the days and weeks following the exchange. The world that had been built across the entire preceding century, the specific achievement of a civilization that had genuinely done remarkable things alongside the things that had brought it to this moment, was being reduced in the space of hours to the ruins and the radiation and the silence that the wasteland preserves. The 2 hours of the exchange were not experienced from inside as 2 hours. They were experienced as the specific alterations in the world that each individual survivor was present for, the specific detonations they could hear or see, the specific changes to their immediate environment that the exchange produced at the location where they happened to be. For the people in the vaults, the exchange was a sound heard through sealed doors and reinforced concrete, a distant rumbling that the vault's construction attenuated into something that could be understood as geological, as the earth responding to what was being done to its surface, as the specific quality of the world communicating its distress through the medium of the stone and metal that separated the vault's interior from what was happening above it. For the people on the surface, who survived the initial exchange in areas far enough from the direct strikes to avoid the immediate lethality of blast and thermal effects, or sheltered in natural or constructed spaces that provided sufficient protection against the initial wave of destruction, the experience was something else entirely. The specific experience of a world that was still present but had become irrevocably different, that still contained the physical structures and natural features that it had contained before the bombs fell, but that no longer contained the civilization those structures had served. The silence that followed was perhaps the most profound transformation of all, more immediately legible to human perception than the physical changes that the bombs had produced. The pre-war world had been a loud place, not oppressively so, not in any way that the people who lived within it would have identified as a defining characteristic of their experience, but loud in the continuous and overlapping way of a civilization that was always conducting its business, always moving its goods and its people, always generating the acoustic signature of purposeful human activity at scale. The traffic and the machinery and the voices and the music and the 10,000 other sounds of a civilization at work had been so constant a feature of the pre-war acoustic landscape that their absence, in the hours after the exchange, was its own kind of event, not simply the removal of noise, but the arrival of a silence that had a positive quality, a presence of its own, a weight that filled the space that the civilization's sounds had previously occupied, and that communicated, more immediately than any visual or physical evidence, that something had changed that was not going to change back. The wasteland that would eventually develop from these ashes was not the pre-war world, minus the people and the working infrastructure. It was a new condition, shaped at every point by the pre-war world's legacy, its physical remains, its preserved knowledge, its institutional inheritances, both the explicit ones, like the Vault program, and the implicit ones, embedded in the values and habits and ways of understanding the world that the survivors carried with them into whatever came after, but not continuous with the carry. Pre-war world in any way that would have been recognizable to someone who had known only the world that the bombs had ended. The long work of whatever the wasteland would eventually become had begun in the silence after the last detonation, in the specific quality of a world that had been made to start over without anyone who remained within it having chosen that particular form of beginning. And so the old world ended, not with resolution, not with the clarity that endings in stories are supposed to provide, not with any sense that the suffering had produced the understanding that might have made it worthwhile. It ended as historical endings end abruptly, incompletely, with enormous amounts of the story still untold, and enormous numbers of the people who might have told it no longer available to do so, with the ruins preserving some things and destroying others according to no principle that the people who had built those things would have chosen, with the silence settling over the landscape in the particular way that silences settle when the sound they replace was not something that had been ready to stop. What was lost on October 23rd, 2077, cannot be fully inventoried. It was not only the lives, though the lives were the most important thing, and their loss was the most fundamental fact of what happened. It was also the Tuesday afternoon in the diner, which would not occur again in any form recognizable to the people who had lived within it. It was the specific quality of the ordinary that the pre-war world had produced, and that the wasteland could not reconstruct from its ruins. Because the ordinary is not a thing that can be preserved in physical form, but a condition that arises from the continuous habitation of a world by the people who have built their expectations around it. The Nuka-Cola machine in the corner of the abandoned diner still stood after the bombs fell, still contained its product behind its sealed dispensing mechanism, still displayed its cheerful imagery on the screen that the electromagnetic pulse had darkened. What was gone was the person who had been going to feed their caps into it, and the afternoon into which they had been going to carry their bottle. and the ordinary world in which the gesture of buying a Nuka-Cola had been so unremarkable as to require no particular attention or recording or preservation against the possibility of its loss. The pre-war world is gone now in ways that even the wasteland's extraordinary preservation of its physical remains cannot address. What remains in the ruins and the terminals and the sealed vaults and the objects that outlasted the people who made them is evidence of what was sufficient evidence to reconstruct in significant detail the character and the process, trajectory, and the specific texture of the civilization that ended on October 23rd, but not the civilization itself, which existed only while the people who constituted it were present to constitute it, and which ended when their presence ended. The evidence is what we have. The listening that is done with it, the patient, meditative, attending to what the ruins say about the world they came from, is perhaps the closest thing to recovering what was lost, that the distance between then and now permits. The wanderer who moves through the wasteland moves through the pre-war world's afterlife, through the space that the old civilization continues to occupy in the form of its physical legacy. And the movement is a kind of conversation between the present and the past, a negotiation between what was and what is, conducted in the language of ruins and recovered objects, and the specific silence of places that were once loud with the business of living and have not been loud since. This conversation does not end. It continues as long as there are people to conduct it, as long as the ruins persist in the forms that permit the reading they invite, as long as the evidence of what the pre-war world was remains available to the patient attention of those willing to learn what it has to say. A civilization built around nuclear technology develops different habits, entirely an orientation toward the physical, toward the centralized, toward immense visible systems of production and extraction and power generation that require large institutions to maintain them, and that encourage populations to think of progress not as something invisible flowing through wires and signals, but as something material and monumental and heavy enough to reshape landscapes. The America of Fallout did not merely use atomic power. It organized its understanding of modernity around the atomic principle itself. The atom became promise and weapon and spiritual metaphor all at once. The symbolic center of a culture that believed human ingenuity had finally discovered the mechanism through which scarcity and limitation could be permanently conquered. And for a time, it seemed that belief might actually be true. The decades after the war unfolded beneath an atmosphere of confidence so immense that it bordered on theological certainty. Industry expanded with astonishing speed. Cities stretched outward beneath neon and chrome. Corporations grew to scales that blurred the line between private enterprise and governmental authority. Consumer culture intensified into something almost ceremonial, an endless performance of abundance in which every household appliance, an automobile, and processed meal carried the subtle implication that history itself had reached a kind of stable conclusion. This confidence did not emerge from nowhere. The United States had survived the greatest war in human history, with its industrial base not merely intact, but strengthened. Its rivals lay in ruins. Its military capacity was unmatched. Its scientific institutions possessed resources beyond anything previous civilizations could have imagined. In our world, this supremacy eventually evolved into a more unstable and uncertain relationship with globalization and digital interdependence. In Fallout's world, however, the supremacy calcified into assumption. America did not merely believe itself powerful, it believed itself destined. And destiny changes the way a civilization interprets warning signs. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the atomic dream deepened its hold on the national imagination. Nuclear reactors appeared everywhere. Entire suburban neighborhoods drew power from compact atomic grids. Automobiles promised near-limitless travel, powered by miniature fusion cells. Domestic robots entered households, not as luxuries, but as symbols of inevitability. Evidence that the future had arrived precisely as promised in magazine illustrations and government exhibitions and corporate advertisements depicting smiling families beneath mushroom cloud sunsets, transformed into icons of peace. The culture of Fallout's America possessed an extraordinary capacity to aestheticize danger. That may be one of its defining traits. The atom bomb, in our world, became associated primarily with existential fear. In Fallout's timeline, fear remained present, but it was absorbed into spectacle and optimism so effectively that the public learned to treat atomic annihilation less as a genuine possibility and more as the distant shadow accompanying inevitable progress. Civil defense campaigns encouraged children to prepare for nuclear war with cheerful instructional cartoons and brightly colored pamphlets. Companies sold miniature backyard shelters alongside patio furniture and kitchen appliances. Popular entertainment transformed radiation into adventure, mutation into fantasy, apocalypse into marketable imagery. The civilization did not deny the danger, it normalized it. And normalization is often more powerful than denial because it allows people to continue functioning without requiring them to confront the true scale of what they have accepted into ordinary life. By the 70s, the United States of Fallout's world had become something simultaneously magnificent and deeply unstable. The technological achievements were real. Energy production had reached levels previous generations could scarcely imagine. Automation transformed labor. Medicine advanced. Consumer abundance expanded across enormous portions of the population. Yet beneath this prosperity lay structural tensions growing more dangerous with each passing decade. Because the atomic economy depended on resources, enormous resources, oil remained essential despite the rise of nuclear power, because the industrial system still required plastics and lubricants and transportation infrastructure on scales too vast to fully replace. Uranium and rare materials became strategically indispensable. The machinery of endless prosperity consumed the planet beneath it with a hunger that no amount of technological optimism could permanently conceal. And the world beyond America's borders was changing too. Other nations industrialized, other militaries modernized, other governments recognized that the same technologies empowering American dominance also carried the potential to destabilize global balances of power permanently. The 20th century in Fallout's timeline did not escape the logic of geopolitical competition simply because atomic technology advanced differently. If anything, the stakes became even greater because every major power understood that future wars would be fought with weapons capable not merely of defeating armies, but of ending civilization itself. The Cold War emerged from this atmosphere like a permanent weather system settling over the planet. In our world, the Cold War was defined partly by espionage and ideology, and the threat of mutually assured destruction balanced precariously atop intercontinental missiles. In Fallout's world, these elements remained, but they fused with resource anxiety and corporate militarization into something harsher and more openly dystopian. The American government became increasingly intertwined with enormous corporations whose influence extended into military research, domestic infrastructure, media, education, and scientific development. Vault-Tec would eventually become the most infamous of these corporations, but it was not unique. The line separating state power from corporate power eroded gradually until ordinary citizens no longer clearly distinguished between them. Advertising adopted the language of patriotism. Patriotism adopted the language of consumption. Military technology entered civilian life so thoroughly that the distinction between domestic prosperity and permanent wartime mobilization began disappearing altogether. This transformation altered the emotional atmosphere of the country. America still presented itself as optimistic, still wrapped itself in the bright colors and polished surfaces of retro-futurist abundance. But beneath that, aesthetic confidence lay growing exhaustion and paranoia. Surveillance expanded, anti-communist rhetoric intensified, loyalty became commercialized and ritualized. The nation increasingly behaved like a civilization, attempting to convince itself that it remained stable, precisely because instability had already begun spreading beneath the surface. And then came the resource wars. If the atomic age represented Fallout America's ascent, the resource wars represented the beginning of its irreversible moral and geopolitical collapse. By the 21st century, global reserves of oil and other critical resources had diminished catastrophically. International alliances fractured under pressure, economies destabilized. Nations that had spent decades proclaiming cooperation and progress began openly fighting for access to the raw materials necessary to maintain industrial civilization. The old promises of endless abundance finally collided with physical reality. And physical reality won. Europe descended into conflict first. The European Commonwealth, strained by energy shortages and internal tensions, fragmented into violence. Wars erupted across the Middle East over remaining oil reserves. Nuclear exchanges occurred on smaller regional scales. Entire governments collapsed beneath economic pressure and military defeat. The United States watched all of this while insisting it remained secure. But security built upon global extraction cannot survive global collapse indefinitely. America responded the way powerful empires throughout history often respond when decline becomes visible, through militarization. The armed forces expanded dramatically. Research into advanced weapons accelerated. Domestic propaganda intensified. Civil liberties eroded quietly beneath the justification of national emergency. Canadians would eventually experience this transformation directly when the United States annexed Canada in order to secure supply lines to Alaska and protect strategic resources from disruption. The annexation revealed something important about pre-war America. Beneath all the chrome and optimism and patriotic spectacle, the civilization had become frightened. Frightened civilizations are dangerous because fear distorts proportion. It encourages governments to treat extraordinary measures as temporary necessities, even after those measures become permanent structures of authority. Fallout's America increasingly resembled a nation preparing not merely for war, but for civilizational siege. Soldiers patrolled streets. Corporations developed experimental technologies with minimal ethical oversight. Citizens disappeared under accusations of disloyalty or communist sympathy. Riots broke out as shortages intensified despite official reassurances that prosperity remained secure. The old dream still existed aesthetically, but materially, it was dying. Nowhere was this contradiction clearer than in the relationship between the American public and the technologies surrounding them. Household robots continued cheerfully serving families, even as unemployment and economic anxiety spread. Advertisements promised luxury while rationing increased. Television personalities smiled reassuringly, while military conflicts expanded across continents. The civilization became performative. It continued acting like the future was bright because acknowledging the alternative would require confronting the possibility that the entire atomic dream had always depended upon impossible assumptions about growth and consumption and human nature itself. And still, even during these years of decline, the world retained moments of extraordinary beauty. That is important to remember. Fallout's pre-war America was not merely a nightmare waiting to happen. People still fell in love. Families still gathered for dinner beneath glowing kitchen lights. Teenagers still imagined futures for themselves. Musicians still performed. Children still played in suburban streets, while distant geopolitical tensions remained abstract. Background noise carried faintly through television broadcasts and newspaper headlines. Civilizations do not experience collapse continuously. Most people live ordinary lives right until the moment ordinary life becomes impossible. That truth gives Fallout's apocalypse much of its emotional power. The bombs did not fall upon a world already dead. They fell upon a world still attempting to continue, still insisting on tomorrow even while the structures supporting tomorrow were failing one by one. By the time China and the United States entered open war, The transformation was nearly complete. China invaded Alaska, seeking access to critical resources. America responded with overwhelming military force and increasingly experimental technologies, including power armor that transformed infantry into walking tanks capable of reshaping battlefield tactics entirely. The war became total, not merely militarily total, but psychologically total. Every aspect of society bent towards survival and victory. Scientific research accelerated beyond ethical restraint. Biological weapons programs expanded. Artificial intelligence advanced under military oversight. Vault-Tech began constructing the Vault network, publicly presented as a humanitarian effort to preserve segments of the population in case of nuclear catastrophe. But the Vaults were never truly about preservation alone. They were experiments. That fact may represent the final moral collapse of pre-war America. Faced with the possibility of extinction, the government and its corporate partners did not simply prepare shelters. They prepared controlled environments designed to test human behavior under extreme conditions. Entire populations were assigned roles inside social laboratories intended to generate data for long-term survival strategies and political objectives. The civilization had become so consumed by systems and management and institutional logic that even apocalypse itself became an opportunity for experimentation. And still, the public largely continued living. That is the haunting thing. Even in the final months before the Great War, diners remained open, commercials continued airing. Families bought groceries and planned weekends, and argued about ordinary things while somewhere beyond their immediate awareness, the machinery of civilization moved steadily toward irreversible catastrophe. Then came the morning of October 23rd, 2077. The sirens, the flashes, the impossible realization spreading across cities in the final seconds before impact that all the reassurances and slogans and strategic calculations had failed completely. The Great War lasted less than 2 hours. Civilization ended faster than a work shift, and afterward came silence, unlike any silence humanity had ever known before. The world the wanderer inherits is born from that silence. The ruins scattered across the wasteland are not random debris. They are the physical memory of a civilization that believed itself too advanced to collapse, too intelligent to destroy itself completely, too technologically sophisticated to remain vulnerable to the oldest human patterns of fear and competition and denial. But history does not exempt civilizations because they are advanced. Sometimes advancement only increases the scale upon which collapse becomes possible. And so the wanderer moves through the afterlife of America's atomic dream, through shattered suburbs and abandoned laboratories and rusting highways where the future once seemed close enough to touch. Every ruined vault and broken robot and faded billboard tells part of the same story. A story about confidence without wisdom, power without restraint, progress without reflection. A story about people who believed there would always be more time, until there wasn't. The question that the pre-war timeline ultimately leaves open, the question that the ruins cannot answer, and the terminals cannot resolve, and the preserved artifacts can only gesture toward without ever arriving at, is whether the civilization that produced the Great War understood, at any level sufficient to have mattered, what it was doing to itself. Not the specific actors in the specific rooms where the most consequential decisions were made, because those people understood quite precisely what they were doing, which is precisely why they made the preparations they made for their own survival, while the populations they governed were told that preparations of that kind were premature and alarmist and inconsistent with the confidence in institutional competence that the government's management of the situation warranted. The question is directed at the civilization itself, at the aggregate entity that corporate advertising and government propaganda and the daily texture of ordinary life had constructed across a century of atomic development, whether that entity, understood as something more than the sum of its most consequent individual decisions, possessed at any point the capacity to recognize the trajectory it was on and choose differently. The honest answer, which the timeline supports without fully delivering, is that it almost did. This almost is the most important word in the pre-war history, and it deserves more attention than the mythology of the wasteland generally gives it. The mythology prefers clarity. The pre-war world was corrupt. The bombs were inevitable. The destruction was the earned consequence of a civilization that had made itself unworthy of continuation. This clarity has its uses. It provides the wasteland survivors with a stable narrative about what they have inherited and why. A story whose moral architecture is simple enough to sustain action and to organize the building of whatever comes next. But it is not an honest account of what the pre-war timeline actually documents, which is something considerably more complicated than earned inevitability. The scientists who published the resource depletion projections that the government acknowledged and did not act on were not working within a civilization that was incapable of acting on them. The civilization had the technical capacity to transition toward more sustainable energy arrangements. Nuclear technology itself, properly directed toward energy production rather than weapons development, represented exactly the kind of abundance the scientists were arguing the resource situation required. What the civilization lacked was not the technical capacity for a different outcome, but the political capacity, the ability to translate accurate understanding of the situation into institutional decisions that would have prioritized the long-term survival of the civilization over the short-term interests of the specific actors, with sufficient power to prevent or enable the necessary changes. The gap between what the civilization knew and what it chose to do with what it knew was not a gap of knowledge, but a gap of will. And the gap of will was not natural or inevitable, but was itself produced by specific institutional arrangements and specific distributions of power that had specific histories and had been created by specific decisions and could, in principle, have been arranged differently. The people who understood this and who tried to act on it exist in the pre-war record alongside everyone else, not celebrated and not particularly numerous, but present, documented in the terminals and the holotapes and the physical evidence of their attempts with the same impartiality that the pre-war civilization's preservation mechanisms extended to everything else. The researchers who refused to continue weapons development programs they found unconscionable and who documented their refusal in the careful language of people who understood that their refusal would have professional consequences, that the professional consequences were worth sustaining. The journalists who published information about the resource situation and the military campaigns and the institutional arrangements that the official information environment was designed to prevent the public from understanding, fully published it in the spaces that remained available for that kind of publication for as long as those spaces continued to exist. The ordinary citizens who participated in the political processes that the pre-war world still maintained in formal terms and who used their participation to advocate for the kinds of changes that the system's most powerful actors were organized to resist. None of these efforts produced the outcome they were aimed at. The civilization did not change its direction in response to the people who were trying to change it. The bombs fell anyway, on the schedule that the institutional logic of the resource wars and the Sino-American conflict had been building toward, regardless of the efforts of the people who understood what that schedule meant and tried to intervene in it. But the failure of these efforts is not evidence that they were not real, or that the people who made them were naive, or that the pre-war civilization was so thoroughly constituted by its worst institutional expressions that resistance to those expressions was impossible. The resistance was real. The possibility it represented was real. The almost is real, and the real almost is more important to carry into whatever comes next than the cleaner story of inevitable catastrophe that the mythology prefers. The children of the pre-war world who entered the vaults on October 23rd carried with them something that no terminal record and no physical artifact and no institutional document preserves with adequate completeness. the specific quality of childhood in a civilization that believed, with whatever degree of genuine or performed conviction, in its own future. Children do not experience the institutional arrangements that structure their lives as institutional arrangements. They experience them as the nature of the world, as the way things are, as the background condition of reality against which their own specific lives unfold. The children who grew up in pre-war America, who watched the Mr. Handy float through the kitchen on its thrusters, who drank Nuka-Cola from the bottles that the machine dispensed in exchange for caps, who attended schools where the curriculum's treatment of the resource wars and the Sino-American conflict reflected the government's information management with a thoroughness that left no visible seam between education and commentation. Propaganda. These children experienced all of this as normal in the specific way that childhood normalizes whatever it finds itself inside. What this meant for the children who descended into the vaults was that they carried with them an unexamined version of the pre-war world's deepest assumptions, not the explicit ideology, which even children could recognize as something being communicated rather than something simply true, but the structural assumptions beneath the ideology, the ones so thoroughly embedded in the texture of daily life that they had never been presented as assumptions at all. The assumption that institutions, however imperfect, were fundamentally oriented toward the welfare of the people they contained. The assumption that technology represented progress in a direction worth traveling. The assumption that tomorrow would arrive and would be, in some meaningful sense, continuous with today. These assumptions had been built into the pre-war world at a level too deep for any amount of critical engagement with the world's surface to reach, and the children who carried them into the vaults carried them into the post-war world that eventually developed from the vault's contents, where they became the inherited framework within which the first post-war generations understood their situation and made their decisions. The specific tragedy of this inheritance is legible in the early settlement records of the wastelands' first communities, in the ways that the survivors of the vaults and the surface tried to reconstruct the familiar out of the grays. Available rubble tried to build institutions that replicated the structures they had known, because those structures were the only models they possessed for how a functioning society organized itself. The trade relationships that developed between early settlements reproduced, often without deliberate intention, the commercial logic of the pre-war economy, because commercial logic was what the survivors understood as the natural form of economic organization. The authority structures that emerged within and between early communities reproduced, again, often without deliberate intention, the hierarchical patterns that the pre-war world had instilled in everyone who had lived within it as the natural form of governance. The civilizational inheritance was not only the physical artifacts and the preserved knowledge and the vault program's deliberate, experimental frameworks. It was also the less visible inheritance of what people understood as normal, as natural, as the way things simply were when they were functioning correctly. This invisible inheritance is perhaps the most consequential thing the pre-war world left to the wasteland it produced. The physical ruins could be salvaged or rebuilt, or simply left to deteriorate into irrelevance. The preserved knowledge in the terminals could be applied to new purposes, or rejected as the record of a civilization whose example was more cautionary than instructive. The vault experiments could be understood, and their institutional logic explicitly repudiated. But the deep assumptions, the structural expectations about how power works, and what institutions are for, and what progress means, and what a good life looks like, these were carried in the psychology of the survivors themselves, transmitted not through any deliberate act of cultural preservation, but through the unconscious reproduction of familiar patterns in the work of building something new from familiar materials. The communities that managed to do something genuinely different, that built forms of organization and forms of relationship and forms of governance that did not simply reproduce the pre-war world's institutional logic in the new setting, are the rarest, and in some respects, the most significant achievements documented in the wasteland's post-war record. They are rare because doing something genuinely different from what you have always known requires seeing what you have always known clearly enough to recognize its contingency, to understand that the patterns it established are patterns rather than nature, that they can be done otherwise by people who choose to do them otherwise. This kind of seeing is difficult in any circumstances. It is particularly difficult in the circumstances of the wasteland, where survival has its own imperatives, and where the people doing the seeing are doing it with the tools that the very system they are trying to see clearly provided them. The water merchants of the early hub who decided that water, as the resource whose control was most completely equivalent to control of survival itself, should be organized around access rather than profit, and who built the institutional arrangements necessary to sustain that decision against the inevitable pressures that commercial logic applied to any resource of sufficient scarcity and sufficiency value, were doing something harder than it appears in retrospect. They were building against the grain of what they knew, using the institutional tools the pre-war world had provided to reach an outcome. The pre-war world had systematically prevented. The outcome did not last in its original form. Nothing in the wasteland lasts in its original form. But the attempt was made, and the attempt is documented, and the documentation of the attempt is evidence that the inheritance of the pre-war world did not entirely foreclose the possibility of learning from it. The followers of the apocalypse, encountered now across generations of institutional development from their founding, carry within their current practice the specific tension that any institution attempting to sustain a counter-institutional purpose across time must eventually confront the tension between the mission and the organization, between the thing the institution was created to do and the thing the institution increasingly must do to sustain itself as an institution capable of doing anything at all. The terminals of followers' facilities document this tension with the honesty that characterizes the organization's best traditions. Field medics, writing about the compromises the supply situation forces them to make. Researchers, documenting the gap between the knowledge they possess and the knowledge they are able to transmit in a wasteland whose educational infrastructure remains inadequate to the task. Administrators managing the relationships between the followers and the political entities whose tolerance is necessary for the organization's continued operation in ways that the organization's founding principles would not always have endorsed. This is the form that integrity takes in the wasteland, not the absence of compromise, which is unavailable to any institution attempting to function in conditions as constrained as the wastelands, but the maintenance of honesty about the compromises being made and the costs they carry. The followers who write about their compromises in their personal logs and their field reports are doing something that the pre-war world's institutions, at their best, also did, and that the pre-war world's institutions, at their worst, systematically prevented maintaining the institutional self-awareness that makes course correction possible, keeping alive the ability to recognize the gap between what an institution says it is and what it actually does, without allowing that recognition to become either paralysis or cynicism. The long arc of the pre-war timeline, traced from the quiet divergence of the post-war years through the atomic dream's elaboration and the resource war's accumulation and the Sino-American war's escalation and the final morning when the deterrence failed. This arc is not a story about destiny. Destiny is a framework that retrospect imposes on contingency, a way of understanding that what happened had to happen in order to avoid the more difficult understanding that it might not have. The pre-war world made choices across the entire span of its existence, choices made by real people, operating within real institutions, under real constraints, and those choices accumulated into the trajectory that ended on October 23rd. Other choices could have accumulated differently. The differently is not available now. The bombs have fallen, the silence has settled, the wasteland is what it is, but the differently was available then, and its availability then is the most important fact about the pre-war timeline for the people who inherit its consequences, because it is the fact that establishes that what happened was not natural and was not inevitable and was not the expression of something fixed and permanent in human nature that will always produce the same outcome, regardless of what choices are made. The wanderer who understands this carries something different through the wasteland from the wanderer who does not optimism exactly, because the wasteland provides insufficient grounds for optimism as a settled disposition, but the specific quality of attention that comes from knowing that what exists was made rather than found, that it was made by choices and can be remade by different ones, that the ruins through which the wanderer moves are not the expression of what human civilization inevitably becomes, but of what one human civilization became through the specific choices it made and failed to make in the specific conditions of its specific history. This understanding does not make the wandering easier. In certain respects, it makes it harder because it removes the comfort of inevitability and replaces it with the weight of responsibility, the understanding that what comes next is also being made by choices. Right now, in the daily decisions of the people who are alive in the wasteland at this moment and who are building, whether or not they understand themselves to be building, the civilization or the absence of civilization that will constitute the future's inheritance from the present. The pre-war world built extraordinary things and failed at the most important thing, which was building a civilization capable of sustaining itself and the people within it across the ordinary span of human time. The wasteland inherits both the extraordinary things and the failure, and the work of deciding what to do with both has been underway since the first survivors emerged from the vaults and the shelters and the fortunate geographies that had kept them alive into a world that did not look like anything they had been prepared for. That work continues. It continues in the settlements and the trade routes and the institutional experiments and the personal decisions of every person who wakes up in the wasteland and decides, again, how to spend a day in a world that has not yet finished deciding what it wants to be. The pre-war world's story is finished. The wasteland's story is not. And the distance between those two facts is precisely the space in which the most important questions about what human civilization is capable of are still, in the wasteland's slow and difficult present, being answered. Rest now in the knowledge that this story has already been told in full, that its ending is known, that the morning you wake into will still be there when you open your eyes. The pre-war world could not know what was coming. You can rest in the knowledge that it has already come and gone, that the bombs have already fallen in the world we have been walking through together, that the silence after the exchange has already settled, and the wasteland has already begun the long work of becoming whatever it will eventually be. The Nuka-Cola machine is quiet in the corner of the abandoned diner. The vault door is sealed. The mushroom clouds have risen and dispersed into the atmospheric record of a world that chose its direction in the middle of a century that still believed it was choosing toward the future. You are not in that world. You are here, in the dark, in the quiet, in the specific safety of a present that is still intact. Let the old world rest beneath its ruins, where it has always been resting, patient and still and complete in all its complexity and all its tragedy and all its genuine beauty, waiting with the patience of things that have nowhere left to go. The story is finished. The telling is done. Sleep now, wanderer. The world you know still has its mornings, and one of them is coming for you, steady and unhurried in the hours ahead.